May I add a comment to the last piece? Um, I think there's another aspect of military suicides as well that has to do with the finite date of either an end of tour of duty overseas or a finite end of time in service. And so stop loss has certainly been had a big effect on hopelessness.
Define that?
On hopelessness.
No, the stop loss, what does that mean?
I'm sorry, stop loss was enlisted service members sign a contract for a fixed period of time, 3 years, 4 years, whatever it might be, and it ends exactly on that day. Stop loss continued them on for, it's been implemented in a number of different ways, but it in essence, their end of time in service no longer is the end of time in service, and they usually don't know when. They don't necessarily know when it might be. The other is this never-ending combat situation where, having been in both the Gulf War and Somalia, they were two very different experiences. And I know in the Gulf War, there was a feeling of, initially there's certainly a feeling of hopelessness of, gosh, we're going to be here for, I know my sense was we were going to be there for 2.5 or 3 years before the war began. And I think that was the sense that the media had built up to the American public, and and I think we all had that sense. And then there was the 6-week aerial campaign, and then there's a 3 or 4 day ground war, and then there's a few minor skirmishes, and then suddenly it's done. But Somalia was this dragged on thing, and folks going back again, and that was, I have to say, in my sense, when my unit went back again, and I had my own end of time in service, it was pretty tough on some of the guys to know that they were going back, and they knew what they were going back to. And they knew it was. There was no purpose or point to Somalia. There was no end goal. And so I could certainly see where folks from those experiences. I'm just inferring that Iraq and Somalia would certainly have some comparable pieces as well, and that having an open-ended war and having stop loss where you no longer have this, sort of I can make it for another 55 days before I get out of the military. I think that both of those are important.
Okay, well, I think that the question that would come to mind at this point is how, based on the fact of the strengths and the weaknesses and the things that have worked and the things that haven't worked, how could we work together? In what way could we provide help or service to dealing with some of these issues? Obviously, there's more research that needs to be done. Some of that's out of the realm of the people that are here, but Robbie White's obviously involved in that. But the question is, what, from a public and professional standpoint, can the people here, sitting here, BU, the Department of Health Law, Bioethics, and Human Rights, do to help with this situation? I think we've identified a lot of the problems. You've been successful in many, many areas. The question is, what could we do to help?
You want to go first, or you want me to go first?
You go ahead, and
I'll give the quick answer to that.
Besides give money.
Well, no, I'm not going to do that.
Which one of you has the BU checkbook today?
At the top of the list, believe it or not, is simply welcoming service members home. Mm-hmm. And by that, I mean saying hello, conversation, polite, listening to the veteran at the veteran's own speed for whatever the veteran wants to talk about. That is probably the best thing to do. What the public can do is volunteer at VAs to learn more about what's going on with veterans. Those are the real easy, common sense things to do. But in terms of policy, the first set of things that we really need are facts. How many went to the war? How many came back from the war? What kind of conditions do they have? What kind of challenges do they have? Those are the very salient starting points that scientists need, and then they can start doing research.
And what are the barriers to achieving that?
The first barrier to achieving that was the enormous amount of the height of the brick wall erected mainly by the previous administration, and it's starting to come down a little bit in this administration when it comes to releasing data. Here's what I mean. Simple questions that Anthony raised. What's the percentage of women who went to the war? Well, now it's about 10%, and for the Gulf War it was about 6%. That type of simple information usually requires a Freedom of Information Act request to the military. The military's not, freely releasing that kind of information. And that's just a very easy example. So the Department of Defense has barriers to this. The second barrier is the Department of Veterans Affairs. They're a slow-moving, large agency, and getting them to recognize new emerging trends is very difficult. So putting people in place at DoD and VA who want to cooperate with sharing data and then who can recognize emerging trends and then act quickly would probably help reduce some of those barriers.
Gosh, I didn't, well, a couple areas. One that I'm thinking of is this new law that veterans have finally seen passed this year, Gulf War veterans, that there are going to be, if the law is successful, which is an if, and if it's not, then we obviously will continue to do the kind of work that we do. But if the law is successful in getting the CIA to declassify all of these Gulf War documents that may contain chemical exposure information, supposing just a random number, it involves a million documents. What does that mean? They've now been released. There's a million documents out there. I know that Paul and I are, we've been through those days when we've gone through lots of FOIA requests, and there are people out there that have done, Gulf War veterans who have gone out there and done those kind of things, but that wears out pretty quickly. If there are research institutions like the ones here that are involved that can find a work study project for undergraduates or graduate students who may be interested in combing through for specific kinds of information, those kinds of things where you've actually got a workforce to actually comb through these documents and to look for key things. And I would assume that the documents would be at least a million documents, if not millions of documents. So those kinds of things, by people who understand how to do research, and are thorough and are careful and are, those kind of things. That's one that I can certainly think of. I didn't realize that this was where we were going to be going with things, and so I'm going to just do a little bit more thinking, and I guarantee I'll have another couple thoughts in a minute.
Well, that's good. I'll chime in and go back to the PowerPoint that I had from earlier, and this gives me a chance to have a little bit more robust conversation about where do we go from here. We've been doing this for 15 years.
Yes.
I still remember the evening, actually it was more than one evening, when Anthony would call me when I was the executive director at the Gulf War Resource Center in Washington, and our bill was pending and about to get voted on, and I'm going to embarrass you in public. And he would scream at me, "Paul, keep fighting, get more co-sponsors, get in there and fight for those bills." There was one point in all of this in 1998 where it looked like we weren't going to get anything. And Anthony here on my left, your right, was screaming at me on the phone. Was it fair to say you were screaming? No, only as a drill sergeant could to a friend, all right? It's an Army thing. And we actually, the next morning met with Chairman Shays, and he said we were in jeopardy of losing both of our bills on Gulf War veterans. And he said, "Do you want the half a loaf?" which was just creating the research advisory committee that Dr. White now works on? Or do you want the full loaf, which contains the disability benefits and the IOM research? And I said, we want to go for both. And he looked at me, Chairman Chris Shays from Connecticut, and he said, well, you might lose and you might not get anything. And my response to him was that if anybody ever knew that I was in a room and both of these bills were still on the table and I didn't fight to my last breath to get both bills, then I couldn't live with myself for the rest of my life. And the second thing is we needed both bills. And Chairman Shea said, okay, you want both bills? We'll fight for both bills. And a kind gentleman by the name of Senator Byrd made sure we got both of our bills through. But that's the kind of advocacy that we've been doing for 15 years. And where do we need to go in the next couple of years, or even in the next couple of months or days? VA and DoD simply need to hire more mental health care professionals. They need to. The military is short between 400 and 800, and if they don't have enough staff, then the veterans aren't going to be examined before they go to war, when they come home from war, or when the veteran needs treatment, that they won't be seen. So if that means a draft, who raised the draft? Dr. Glantz raised the draft. If we have to go there, we might have to go there to draft doctors to make sure we have enough to make sure that our service members get the care that they need. Because if these were legs being blown off, I'm sure that America would have no problem having a draft for surgeons. Here we have service members coming back with TBI and PTSD. We may need to have a draft to make sure we have enough mental health professionals to make sure our service members and veterans get care.
I'm going to add about the Congressionally Directed Medical Research Program, and it was wonderful that we were fortunate to invite those folks to come from Fort Detrick to our Disabled American Veterans Conference in Wisconsin about a week ago. And in the last 20 years, they've given away $5.4 billion with a B for military health research, and it's been on everything from breast cancer to TBI, PTSD. They recently had in the last 2 years or so, they had an appropriation of $300 million for TBI and PTSD research alone. So those kinds of projects are fantastic in getting folks out there, but I'm going to say something that in research institutions you probably don't hear very often, and that's that there are not enough people applying for these grants. And we need to get the word out there that we need more people applying for this grant funding. Boston University, you all are doing a fine job already with Dr. White and with the Dr. Kim Sullivan and others doing a phenomenal job, but spreading the word to colleagues out there that there's funding, and collaboration is another critically important thing. That what I hear from my scientist colleagues on these 3 research panels that I serve on, and I for whatever reason I happen to be the only Gulf War veteran that serves on all 3 of them, and it certainly gives me a perspective from there. But what I hear over and over are that the days of a lone scientist working this out in his or her laboratory are long gone, and that this is going to be an interdisciplinary, interinstitutional effort to solve Gulf War illness issues. I'm only talking about Gulf War illness issues, but I'm sure that the same things apply for when there's prosthetics research. And so this year, I'm going to get the number wrong, but I think it was $680 million is how much the CDMRP had to give away for military health research. Now, that obviously won't apply to the law side, but to the public health side. And certainly all of you have colleagues across the country, people who may be in other disciplines and so on, but helping to spread the word that this money is out there. And the second piece is that VA, as I mentioned in my presentation this morning, we've been finally successful in getting VA on the Gulf War illness side to no longer be doing stress studies, which we saw the Pentagon still doing and quite proud of all the way through last night. I'm hopeful that we're going to be successful in getting more funds there. Now, I understand that the Senate's objection, I'd mentioned this morning the House put in $25 million for Gulf War illness research. The Senate only is putting in $8 million. The objection is because we're just simply not getting enough proposals. So I'll just say it again: there's more money out there than we get proposals in, and we need to get more proposals in. So please help to spread the word elsewhere. And for grad students who may be going on to post-grad study as well, or working on your PhDs and so on, there's no reason why that you can't be actively getting involved. And this is some cutting-edge stuff that is it was changing the way that we're looking at disease, is what I'm hearing from my scientist colleagues. So please help, and I think those are some very concrete ways in that folks in this room and your colleagues and fellow students can help.
I think I see a question up
Go
there.
ahead.
Sure. Well, the grants are research grants for military health research, and so they're available from on the military side. It's CDMRP. I'll say that again: CDMRP. It's like Congressionally Directed Medical Research Program.Army.mil, and that website is where you look for the DoD grants. For VA, you have to be a VA researcher, and I think that they have some interest in recruiting people to come in even part-time or half-time and so on to do research at a VA facility as well. Dr. Bobby White would be a fantastic person to talk to on how to do that for on the VA side.
One thing that was mentioned in the last panel, one item that was mentioned in the last panel was reducing stigma so that service members and veterans will want to come forward and get care. One of our major advocacy efforts at Veterans for Common Sense is to try to fight stigma. And here's how we do it. We do it by telling everybody there's a website that they can go to. Oh gosh, it's a Department of Labor. Oh no, I'm drawing a blank now. No, it's America's Heroes at Work. Is that it? I think it's America's Heroes at Work. And it has a very simple lay discussion of what is traumatic brain injury and what is post-traumatic stress disorder that people can read in just a few minutes to understand what's going on. That type of very simple anti-stigma message is very important, because what we want is to have the service member or veteran, if they're in that 1 hour window that you talked about previously, we want to encourage them to come in. Okay, that's half of the battle. The other half of the battle is having the Department of Defense and the Department of Veterans Affairs reach out to service members and veterans. And the first way to do this at the Department of Defense is to actually implement the law that I mentioned, the Force Health Protection Act from 1997. That was a law passed as a lesson learned from the Gulf War and the Vietnam War. The Force Health Protection Act requires the military to do a pre-deployment exam and a post-deployment exam to get a start and a finish of the health of the service member for going into combat. The idea was to end the mystery of Gulf War illness. In other words, did the military deploy unfit service members in the first place in the Gulf War, or were they exposed to something in the war zone that could have made them ill? The problem with that is that the Department of Defense agreed to the law in 1997, and they liked it because they thought it would reduce fraud. Oh, great, if we examine somebody before war and after war, we will cut out all these fraudulent claims because we'll have a thorough paper trail of the health status of the service member / veteran. However, the Department of Defense doesn't have enough doctors to do the pre-deployment exams and the post-deployment exams. Now, what happened in 2004 is Steve Robinson, a very good friend of ours, testified before the Senate and said that the military was violating the law and not doing these exams. What the military was doing was handing out a sheet of paper, or in some cases, if I may, a little personal questionnaire on a little quickie computer sheet. And there were only 2 mental health questions at the time. One was, are you homicidal? Do you want to kill other people? And the other was, are you suicidal? Do you want to kill yourself? And here's what the GAO found when they investigated what these forms called post-deployment health assessments were doing. First, the GAO found that 80% of the service members who checked that they had a problem were actually never referred to see anybody for help. So it became, what do you call it? Where's the lawyers in the room? A pro forma exercise. They just did it to do it. And that turned out to be a joke. The health assessment or screening, while it's better than doing nothing, is not the standard under the law. We want to make sure the service member sits down face to face and sees the mental health care professional. We may not get them in that golden hour. Okay, we're not trying to stop the suicide right when somebody comes home. What we're trying to do is let that service member know that the government cares about your health. We want to let the service member know that we have normalized mental health. Instead of you having to ask for it, ask to see a psychiatrist in front of 200 of your peers in morning formation at 6 o'clock, everybody has to go see the shrink, okay? Let me give you an example. If a police officer is involved...
About the health professional.
Sorry. Sorry about that. What we want to do is have the service member sit down with the doctor as a routine policy. In the civilian world, if a police officer is involved in a shooting, Usually the police officer gets a couple of days off, and then they bring the police officer in to talk to the department mental health professional. Was that right?
Yeah.
Okay. And then the mental health professional will determine whether or not the police officer is fit for duty, then they go back, or maybe they need a little help, or maybe they retire from the police. That process normalizes mental health. Okay, as much as police officers might grumble about it, they know that they're going to have to do it. What we need to do is normalize mental health care so that when service members are coming back, just as the doctor wants to take your pulse and blood pressure and weigh you and ask you a series of other physical questions, the doctor should also be making sure that the service members are given a battery of mental health questions and then looking this service member, soon-to-be veteran, straight in the eye, and you can tell whether or not they've got any problems, especially if the mental health professional has experience. So one of our big advocacy goals, again, is to make sure that the military has enough doctors so that we can do these pre-deployment exams, do the post-deployment exams, and then if the exam finds something, put that service member right into treatment as soon as possible and normalize the whole process. You're up next.
You know, it seems to me as well that, if I remember right, you all had a little bit of a Senate race here in this state not that long ago that had a little bit of impact and interest across the country. And that reminds me of your congressional delegation as well, and that there are, you know, we've been advocates for a long time, and one of the things that helped in 1995, we sat down together, 95 or 96 in Tampa, Florida, and we came up with a unified plan. And it was a 5-point plan for Gulf War illness. It was just 5 things we were asking for, and it took us hours to hash through all of this with all the different folks in the room. But it was really simple, as we needed an investigation to find out exactly what everyone was exposed to. As you know, from the CIA legislation that we've been talking about, that's still ongoing. We needed research to demonstrate what happens to the human body when they're exposed to these substances. We needed treatments based on those research. We needed compensation for those whose health could not be improved, and we needed never again. I guess it's still there. And never again was to prevent what happened to us from happening to another generation of veterans, things like PB and so on. But echoing that message, when we left Tampa, Florida, from, I don't know, 75, 100 of us maybe there, but from all over the country, representing organizations and groups in a lot of different capacities. Some were professionals, some were, you know, just everyday working people, some were, you know, may have still been in the reserves or guard, but that message echoed back all across the country. And so echoing messages is certainly important. I know that in my PowerPoint and in Paul's PowerPoint, we've got a lot of very clear recommendations for what the federal government needs to do as well. And it seems to me that, you know, coming from the faculty of the Boston University Law School, or a joint faculty letter or press release or a meeting with a congressional delegation or a summit or whatever it might be, but taking some of these findings and meeting from there and then asking them to do the same thing beyond that. You know, the election is coming up next week. You'll know who the new folks are. We all will here shortly. And, you know, that's coming to my mind as well, are that sometimes, you know, our voices haven't always been heard, even though we've had some pretty good ideas. And sometimes it's taken our voices a long time to get heard. And, you know, we hear about Bobby White talking about her experiences with, she's known this stuff all along about PB and pesticides. Well, here I'm an activist Gulf War veteran, and I'm learning about her work only 3 or 4 years ago, because she's in the scientific world and we're in the veterans advocacy world, and those didn't always meet. Now they do, but they didn't always meet. Excuse me. Another area is being interested in serving on panels. There are all sorts of, federal advisory panels and so on, and so perhaps should this school or the combined schools have meetings with congressional delegation members expressing an interest to be a volunteer to serve on one or more federal panels. I think several of you from your bios actually already serve on those kind of things, so that maybe that's just speaking to the choir already. But I know that in our presentations we had a lot of concrete solutions and recommendations. The problem is getting them from ideas from people like Paul and me to get them implemented. We've had a lot of success over 20 years, but, 20 years is an awful long time to wait for healthcare.
And, Anthony, you're right. I don't know if you can hear me. You're right, and I agree with what you're saying. We actually have a rare window of opportunity, both with Congress and with the administration. We have Representative Chet Edwards in Texas, for example. He's the chairman of the subcommittee for appropriations, that means they hand out money, that oversees VA. He made sure that there was a Gulf War Veteran Advisory Committee created. That was nice. It got input from Gulf War veterans. He also made sure that because all spending legislation starts in the U.S. House of Representatives, that VA's funding increased about $35 billion in the last 3 or 4 years. So we have a huge window of opportunity with him, for example. We also have Chairman Bob Filner, who's head of the Oversight Committee for VA, called the House Veterans Affairs Committee. He has held about 100 hearings on veterans issues in the last 4 years, including 3 just on Gulf War veterans. And there were 0 between 2001 and 2007. So we also have the Chief of Staff at VA, John Gingrich, who works directly for the Secretary, who's a Gulf War veteran. He commanded an artillery battalion, and he's familiar with Gulf War illness because some of his soldiers who served with him in the war, who are now veterans like him, have returned home sick. And he wants to get to the bottom of it. He has a personal stake in it as a leader who wants to take care of his troops who are now veterans. We also have a secretary who really gets it, Shinseki. And he has actually gone to homeless shelters, and sometimes the same one more than once. That's someone who actually gets it. This type of culture change in the leadership gives us this window of opportunity at VA. The leaders in Congress give us a window of opportunity, and all that's great. What we need to do is make sure that all this momentum continues. And that's why I agree with what you're saying. If someone out there wants to be involved in research on this, there's a very easy way to get involved. You want to get involved in advocacy on this, it's a very easy way to get involved. You just talked to us. And we can make sure that we continue this momentum, because the last thing we would want to have is all these new laws and new regulations that have come into effect die on the vine. We went through that between the period of 1998 and 2002, and it was really, really disappointing. We don't ever want to go there again.
I have a question, Dr. Grodin, for the audience.
Please.
May I? Well, actually, 2 quick questions. One is, first of all, is there anyone here in the room who is a student and is also a veteran currently? Can we talk afterwards? Okay, great, thank you. And then the second question, look forward to it. I'll ask the following question. Is there a student veteran organization on the Boston University campus? Do you know? Not that you're aware of, okay. Small one, okay. Wonderful, okay, great. And then the second question is, we're up here doing a lot of talking, but, I do note that we're also supposed to be asking for audience discussion, and I'm just interested in, we've got people in this room who have enough letters behind all of your collective names to spell all of our names several times over. So what I guess I know for myself, I'd be really interested in hearing, recommendations or thoughts or ideas on, where you all have been hearing what has been happening throughout the day. You've got a lot of different experiences that neither Paul nor I have. I, for one, would be, really interested in hearing what kinds of solutions or recommendations or thoughts or ideas are coming from faculty, from professionals, from students, from staff. That would be my question to the audience.
So ask away on any questions, or if you have any suggestions on what we can do better,
I'll take notes.
we're ready to take notes.
Or what, I guess, and my question is more, this is your conference, that you're hosting, and are there things that perhaps you're suggesting or thinking, or Dr. Enes, I'm looking sort of to you here as well, but I'm just very interested in hearing. See, we've got one already.
Okay.
Well, this is another question for everybody, I guess. And I wasn't here earlier, so I'm not sure if this was already discussed, but there seems to be a fundamental tension in creating policy, doing research, and moving forward in improving health outcomes for vets and people who are in active duty, with the sort of overall mission of the Army and drafting people. The issue of, not drafting people, but having enough officers. The issue of not having enough officers has kind of come up as one reason why people are sent back when maybe they wouldn't, otherwise that wouldn't be the ideal situation. So there seems to be this kind of tension between, there's not enough officers, so the people who are in the military are under overwhelming, undue stress. But at the same time, given all this information, who's going to want to, or I don't know. I mean, I hear about this and I'm like, well, I'm not signing up. I don't know.
Your question is fantastic, and thanks for asking it. This is going to come as a shock to a lot of you in the room. The VA actually brings me to meet with prospective new employees and interns because VA, want to be able to give a broad perspective of what veterans see going on at the VA. And I'll go in and I'll tell them straight, look, VA has had some problems, but VA is actually getting better. And then one time I joked and I said, look, there's a horrible economy out there. Look, you got a lot of student debt. Look, it's going to be tough to find a job. You want job security for 40 years? Well, you're going to have job security for 40 or 50 years for hundreds of thousands, maybe 1 million Iraq and Afghanistan war veterans coming home. Yeah. And when I said that, the VA person rolled their eyeballs and went like this. And they told me, oh, God, Paul, did you really have to say that? The response from the students was that that's what they wanted to hear. They wanted to know that there was job security because there's a difficult economy, but they also wanted to hear the inspirational message that when you go to work at VA, you can actually do some really wonderful things and save a lot of veterans' lives. Has anybody here seen the video about, it's called My Dad's a Hero? It's about a 9-year-old girl doing a voiceover of a VA recruiting commercial describing her dad, who's a VA doctor, and how he is her hero. It's so poignant. And they show pictures of veterans in wheelchairs, veterans with scars, and it says, and my daddy, something words to the effect, he helps veterans with wounds on the outside and on the inside. And it's so good. And I'll make sure that you get this and you can show this to folks, because it really can be a rewarding career to work at VA. If we actually recruit well enough, we may not have to have a draft to force people in.
Sorry, I actually meant more in terms of military, I don't know what the word is, not VA people, but soldiers, troops, yeah.
I understood I get your question.
It's his half.
I understand your question, and there are people that I know. There are people that I know, young people that have decided they wanted to join the military for lots of different reasons. Military recruitment has been very difficult in recent years compared to Several years back, I was mentioning over lunch that in 1992, the high school graduation rate for Army graduates was 99.9, I'm sorry, for Army enlistees was 99.9%. And in the more recent years, and I forget which year it was 04 or 06 or 07 or whatever it was, but was more recent, was down to 82 or 83%, meaning it had dropped by a fifth. And many of those are only qualified for certain occupational specialties. You can look to your left and look to your right, and you're having convicted felons. We're seeing, don't ask, don't tell is probably going away. That's not just because it's a morally right issue or because that there's people at the top that believe in it. These are recruitment and retention issues as well, and so we're seeing all sorts of issues there. But there are people who are willing and interested to serve for a variety of reasons. We had the gentleman that was awarded earlier that decided to enlist in his 50s to be a medical doctor and to serve. And there are lots of ways of giving back. And I know I've been asked the question many times that, would you do it again? I served for 7.5 years. I came back. I'm 100% service connected. I had to medically retire last year. I had a 6-figure job and a career that was really going places with being able to help an awful lot of people, and was a very promising future, and things just continued to decline, and so I had to give that up, and now I'm housebound a lot of the time. And what hurts me is not my own situation. I think that every one of us was prepared to give our lives. So we didn't always think about coming home wounded, but the title of today's series, but the people that I've gotten to know and the people that I've been able to help, the people that we've looked out for each other, the lifelong friends that we've made through unusual circumstances, and the way that the military is going to continue to be there. The war in Iraq would have happened whether I'd served in the military or whether it didn't. The war in Afghanistan would have happened, and so on. But knowing that there are people out there like Paul and others who have served, who get it, and who can do things, I think there will always be a willingness of people to serve, and they serve for every reason you can imagine. The most memorable account that I can remember as one anecdote was a guy who had joined the military so he could get 3 square meals a day, and coming from an extremely impoverished background, and you see everything everything in between. So I think that we do need to get better at health outcomes, because certainly when Gulf War illness issues and PTSD and TBI are on the front page of the newspaper all the time, you're not the only one in this country who is thinking, gosh, that's more risk than I'm willing to take. Or it's not just a risk, it's almost a guarantee that I'm going to come home with something. That's more than I'm willing to take. And so I think that if we can get there and answer these health issues, if we can get there and learn not just from the past, but be able to become forward-looking, and we're able to solve Agent Orange issues and Gulf War illness and PTSD and TBI issues, and have the recruitment so that we don't have all these risk factors for suicide prevention, and maybe even, get out of some of these wars. On a personal advocacy note, I think those kind of things will all come together, and all of those things, TBI research is helping, and prosthetics research are helping diabetics, they're helping other amputees, they're helping car accident victims, they're helping, PTSD research helps, and military sexual trauma help domestic abuse survivors. So there's also a lot of good that comes out of all of this as well, and that benefits the broader society as well. In fact, I learned recently mustard gas has been used as a chemotherapy agent, if that's accurate. I wouldn't prefer to do that experience ever again, but somebody might want to. But that's a really long answer to your question. I hope I got to the meat of your question and maybe gave more beyond that.
Hi, I'm not sure. My name is Kelsey Holt, and I work for a nonprofit called IBIS Reproductive Health. We do clinical and social science research, and we've just started to get interested in the field of military women, and have started some preliminary research on military women and reproductive health. And active duty and veteran. And so I'm kind of new to the issue. I wondered a couple of things, if you could comment on, I know we're speaking of veteran women, so in terms of veteran women's health care, in terms of military sexual trauma, how you see, we talked a lot about PTSD and how there's a lot of good treatments available, and if you can kind of get in and get it recognized that it's good. I wondered if you could sort of say a few words about the parallel for military sexual trauma. And then also, kind of along the same lines of the changing culture that you're seeing in the military, in the VA system. I've heard kind of anecdotally, as I said, just kind of getting into this field, I've heard anecdotally about women veterans kind of not feeling accepted at the VA, and I've heard anecdotal things about that. I wonder if you have thoughts on whether that's improving or kind of what you've seen in that vein.
Really quick on birth defects, there was, I believe, one study that was started on the birth defects among Gulf War veterans as a result of the Life magazine cover that came out in 1995. Jimmy Briggs was the author of that newspaper article, magazine article in Life magazine, and I worked with him for about 2 or 3 months. And it profiled some very sick veterans, and some of those sick veterans had children with very serious birth defects. Here's what happened. When the VA DoD study on birth defects started to show problems, the study was scuttled. I'm not aware of any long-term study by VA and DoD, and I wish Dr. White was here, where they specifically studied not only birth defects among Gulf War veterans, children, but also looked narrowly at the children of the veterans who were sick with Gulf War illness. That answers the first part. You want to answer?
Sure.
that?
MST is clearly a significant issue, and while I suspect that women dealing with MST in the military deal with it at a much greater rate than males. It also happens to males. I'm an MST survivor from the military as well, and a lot of folks aren't willing to. Military sexual trauma, and there are a lot of folks that are not willing to talk about it. But I think destigmatizing everything that we possibly can is really important. And I have a number of women veteran friends who are victims themselves of military sexual trauma and are dealing with it. One is dealing with late onset PTSD from that as well. I do know that when I go to the VA in Madison, Wisconsin, where I live, that there are lots more flyers and brochures and posters and all those outreach materials at the front desk of the VA when you first walk in for women veterans and on military sexual trauma. Also, the longer that we have women in the military, the more that have collectively served. The more that have collectively served, the more that they find each other. And so in Wisconsin, we have an organization called United Women Veterans, and they have a wonderful organization that they reach out to women veterans of all eras. And so they have, one is an 80-something-year-old woman Marine who served in World War II. Obviously, there were not lots of women veterans back then, but when we're talking about 15% today, 15% of, I don't know how big our force is, but I'm 1.5 million. We're talking about cumulatively now a lot of women veterans, and so I know that from my time of going to the VA, I'm seeing more and more women in the VA. I'm not a woman veteran. I cannot even expect to speak on behalf of women veterans, but those are the kinds of things that I'm observing as far as the question on changing the culture for women veterans. I know there's an active movement about that. I know that there's a female general officer and a reserve general in Wisconsin who's very active on women veterans issues. As well, the VA has an advisory committee on women veterans that one of our each state veterans agency. I don't know if you know that there are state departments of Veterans Affairs as well. You have one here in Massachusetts that's headed up by. His first name is Tom. I'm not going to remember his last name. Medal of Honor recipient, the only Medal of Honor recipient in. Who's a state director of Veterans Affairs in the country. He's an amazing guy. But each state veterans agency has a woman veterans coordinator for the state. So that's another possible point of outreach. Besides the VA's outreach, you could probably just Google VA Advisory Committee and then women and veterans, and you should find some things there. If you'd like, I'll give you my card, and I can just connect you up with Wisconsin's Women Veterans Coordinator, and she would, I'm sure she would connect you to everything every resource you can imagine. And thank you for being here and for your interest and support as well.
You're raising a really important subject on the 1 in 7 service members who are women. And in Austin, I have the honor and privilege of serving on an advocacy council. By law, VA is supposed to have an advocacy council at every facility that's comprised of stakeholders who can give input to VA administrators and clinicians on how to improve the VA facility. I'm not aware if the DoD does anything like that at their military installations. During our monthly advocacy meetings, we have time usually where there's 1 or 2 women who almost always raise issues about significant deficiencies and challenges in VA care. And one of the first things they mentioned was the lack of inpatient VA care for women. What that means is if a woman, combat veteran, or a woman MST survivor trying to recover needs care for PTSD, they were put on a lockdown ward with men, okay, because VA lacked the facilities, okay? We kept raising this issue so much that VA is now looking at this nationwide. Similarly, there was a lack of treatment rooms for women. I mean, I lost all modesty when I joined the military, you know? But it's different when you have a woman going in for reproductive issues. They need a little bit more privacy in the rooms. VA is just now getting that in the last few years and putting in the right kind of equipment and facilities. And then the last thing was something that I had to actually watch before I got it. One of the women came to our advocacy council and said she was really sick and tired of getting hit on by men sitting in the waiting room. And I looked and, you know, I'm married. I'm like, what? So I went and I sat in the waiting room, pretending to read a paper, and watched. And some new women veterans came in, and I watched them get hit on over and over again. And even demeaning questions like, are you a veteran? You know, you're in the waiting room at the VA hospital, you know, you're a veteran. You shouldn't have to ask. So it's that kind of culture change that actually needs to happen in some of the VA clinics. And the more we talk about it and say, hey, we need to fix it, because what we did in Austin was let folks know that that kind of behavior is not to be tolerated in the waiting rooms. And you know what? I haven't heard many complaints since, but we had to raise the issue, raise awareness, and tell people to knock it off. So yes, you're raising some really important questions about the changing demographic of the veteran coming back in. And women with a combination of combat PTSD and MST PTSD plus TBI are going to be presenting a whole new set of problems.
Okay. Do you want the last word? There's one more.
Hi, I just
One
had a
more
question regarding the interaction between the VA and the active duty Army system. You were talking a lot about PTSD and the benefits that soldiers receive after their retirement. However, I know that when they are active duty, they're often receiving medication, even though they've been diagnosed with PTSD upon deployment. And during their deployment, they'll receive heavy meds, and then they come back, they'll maybe get an hour of counseling a month if they're lucky, and then they start receiving disability later on. I just wanted to see what kind of policy changes you guys are providing to change that. I mean, I can't believe that the VA would support that kind of system, and I wanted to see what you guys thought about that in general upon deployment.
You're asking a question related to what we call transition. And our goal is to have what we like to term seamless transition. That's where the veteran is like a baton, and it's going from the DoD to the VA system. And what happens, the veteran hears the baton. we want to make sure that the handoff is smooth and seamless. And there's lots of things going on. There's healthcare, and then there's disability benefits are the two major concerns. And when the military has its own record system and the VA has its own record system and they don't talk to each other, continuity of care becomes a greater challenge. That's why organizations like Veterans for Common Sense and almost every other veterans organization out there strongly supports more and more VA staff being placed on military installations and more DoD staff being made available to interact with VA. So when that service member who is about to become a veteran is filling out the paperwork to get discharged, that their medical records and their disability information can get quickly and accurately transmitted to VA so that any medication, any post-operative care, any follow-up, any disability benefits can be provided as quick as possible. That's been a huge problem. I want to say that VA is actually doing better, and DoD is doing better to try to fix what we call the seamless transition process. It's going to be a couple of more years till they get it right. And the biggest solution is the single medical record. If the DoD and VA can agree on that, that'd be great. And then the next big obstacle is the DoD's reluctance to let service members go. At one point, as few as about 4 or 5 years ago, the Department of Defense actually rejected having VA staff at some facilities and blocked veterans groups from helping veterans fill out disability and healthcare enrollment forms for VA. Why? The DoD wanted to keep those service members. They wanted to see if they could be rehabilitated and kept in the Army. That's a legitimate concern. And I will say this in the most polite language I can, is one DoD official told me, he said, look, we don't want you VA types, I worked for the VA at the time, or the veterans advocacy groups dangling college benefits and dangling co-ed life at a college in front of my sergeant who got shot. I want him patched up and sent back to the war. I don't want him on a college campus chasing co-eds. So the military was a little bit reluctant to have the VA and the veterans groups on the posts helping out. So we've got to overcome DoD's resistance to that. As soon as the military knows that a service member is ready or is going to get discharged, then the military needs to hand them over and start all the paperwork and make sure it gets done, and it's done completely and done accurately before the service member walks off the post and becomes a veteran. Does that answer your question?
Hi, how you doing? I have a question about.
Introduce
Can you hear me?
yourself.
Scott Williams. I actually teach ROTC here at Boston University, so I'm just down the street. And thanks for having the conference and inviting us. But I want to go back to just a little bit on the suicide prevention. I think you mentioned a number of 160 in 2009. My question has to do is if we've looked at, you know, what might have been the cause of that. Some of the indicators that we have to talk about is like financial stress, moving, being told your redeployment again. But has there ever been a correlation with respect to, I guess, fits of rage associated with the relationships that the service member has? Because I think this goes into a little bit beyond just taking care of the service member. Because what I hear, you know, I hear stories of service member killed themselves at Fort Hood. They did it, they shot their wife, and then they shot themselves. They hung themselves in front of their wife when they were getting back in. I had a soldier when I was in Iraq who was on Skype and put a gun to his chest while his wife was on the other end of the video conference. And so I don't know if there's been a relationship where this fit of rage because the relationship broke down, which ended in a suicide. And when we talk about the individuals, you know, what are we doing to go beyond the service member and look into taking care of the families? Because we talk about on our redeployment stuff, you have to go back in there, your spouse and your family, they have a battle rhythm going on, they have a routine, and you don't want to disrupt it. But what do we do to make sure that the spouse and the family understand what the soldiers are coming back with, and so that they can be accepting to some of how they react and what they do, so it's, they're working together, and then when this issue comes up, they know where to turn, because I think sometimes they go in, we'll take care of you, but we don't do necessarily marriage counseling or take care of the families. And I don't know if there's been a relationship between the families and some of the suicides that we've seen.
Colonel, thank you for your questions, Colonel Williams. I don't know, I can't tell if you went to the war because I can't see your shoulder from here, but I'm just going to assume you have. Welcome back, and thanks for teaching here on campus. I'm going to start to answer your question with an anecdotal story because we lack a lot of the scientific information that we need. I've had the difficult job of speaking with family members after a service member or a veteran completed suicide. And the overwhelming repeated message that the spouses, children, and parents give is that they needed to know what to expect while the service member was announced that they were going to war, what to expect during deployment, what to expect when the service member came home, and then what anomalies, what changes should they be aware of to look for, and then where they can go to get help. So this conference gives me the opportunity to restate that message from the surviving families. I want to let you know, I believe the military and the VA are starting to do a little bit better job on this. Even Sesame Street has videos on what to share with children when mom or dad comes home from the war, either with physical or psychological injuries. So with that anecdotal story said, and the powerful message from the families, they need more information and they're starting to get it, but I think they still need more. The bigger policy issue is access to care. The worst story is when a service member tries to get care and they don't know where to go on active duty. And in some cases, they may be referred to a chaplain, which may work in the short term, but it's not a mental health professional. Then we also have stigma actually blocking the service member, him or herself, saying, I'm not going to get care because I'm worried about my career. I'm worried what my peers will think of me. Then we also have the problem of recycling service members back to the war again and again. And as I mentioned, we've seen a peak in suicide completions when service members are notified that they're going to go back to a second or subsequent deployment to the war zone. The bottom line answer is that the military and VA are now starting to do some robust research on the causes of suicide, what risk factors there are, and what can be done to mitigate the situation. We support that. We've been calling for that. We say over and over again, we want to know the facts and what does the science say so that when we implement the policy, we at least know that it's based on some factual information and observation and not, a moralistic judgment like you have bad character. We want some fact-based information. I think it may unfortunately take another year or two to get the kind of concrete answers that we need in order to mitigate the suicide epidemic. But I will say this in the most tragic voice that I can. So long as the war is going on, and so long as we don't have enough doctors, and so long as there's repeat deployments, in my view, we're going to continue to have the suicide problem. So we need to be a little bit more vigilant as a society and military leaders and fellow soldiers to watch out for each other to fight suicide.
And just quickly to add to resources for military families that are deployed, each state National Guard should be providing family assistance to all deployed service members, Reserve Guard, and the family members of active duty troops who are left back, who may be just reserves and Guard, I should add. Military installations, of course, have, as I'm sure you well know, have family support groups as well. And then on the veteran side, the vet centers, which are part of the VA, but they were created separately because of stigma in Vietnam about the VA, and veterans needed counseling and needed psychological and psychiatric assistance, psychological assistance. I don't think they provide any actual medical care, but vet centers are now doing family counseling, have been doing for some time as well. So just some added resources there, and perhaps you're already aware of them, but I just wanted to lay that out there as well.
And there's other resources like VA Suicide Prevention Hotline, DOD setting up one. The main thing to do, and this is just simple common sense 101, if a service member or veteran is exhibiting some signs and you're concerned, ask for help or go get it. That's the first step in overcoming the stigma. It's a big deal. And once you overcome that first step, then things can turn out a whole lot better.
Okay. I want to thank Anthony Hardy and Paul Sullivan for enriching this conference enormously. I can't imagine us doing it without you. And Professor Annis, I think, has the last word.
I don't know if it's the last word, but mostly it's to thank you guys for coming, and especially, again, thank Paul and Anthony. And I didn't answer Anthony's question because I'm not really ready to answer it. I mean, I think networking was the most important function of this conference, but we're going to all be meeting tonight, the four of us, so I want to try to come up with at least one thing that you think we could do together tonight, and maybe two, and we'll post it on the website, the law school website, which will have this tape of this whole day's conference on that too, and maybe it'll be something that you can all join us in as well. In any event, again, thank you, Paul and Anthony, and thank all of you, and thank Michael and Winnie for moderating this afternoon.